Good afternoon, good evening, and to some of you, good morning. Welcome to our first in a series of two, that's not a series, sorry, our first of two webinars explaining our transparency, control, consent framework for the online advertising industry. I'm Chris Hartzaker from IAB Europe, despite what my name says on GoToWebinar. And I'm joined by Julia Schulman from AppNexus and Summer Simpson from Quantcast, and we'll be joined later by Heinz Baumann as well from Quantcast. To present this technical standard and explain to you in detail the kind of ins and outs of it and give you guys the opportunity to ask your own questions that you may have after reading it. In terms of the overall process, we're currently in the pre-release phase, so you guys are getting an exclusive look at this before it goes public in a few weeks' time. So without, just to remind you, next week we will have essentially the same webinar. There'll be slightly different presenters, but the topic is going to be the same. So you're not missing out by not joining that, but if you have more, you want to know more, you're welcome to join again. So with that said, I'm going to hand over to Julia and Summer to take you through this.
Sure. So I'm going to tee up the agenda and so basically talk about EU regulatory challenges facing the industry very, very quickly. Talk about how we as an industry thought about solutions to some of these challenges. Go through the goals of this framework that we've thought about, and then Summer is going to take it over from me and go through in much more detail the technical mechanism that a group of us in industry have come up with. So let's get started just to make sure we've got time at the end for questions. So this is probably fairly familiar to a lot of folks in industry, but if you think about data flows in AdTech, and this is a simplified version, the regulatory challenges posed by GDPR and e-privacy to the extent consent is necessary, and also just around transparency. As a consumer shows up on a website, how do we, as an industry, working with our clients, ensure we can disclose to that consumer who is behind the scenes, which companies are actually collecting and using data, how they're using that, whether they might need consent, and who is accessing devices and browsers. We all took a step back and thought really long and hard about various solutions to those issues. So I'm going to talk about how we thought about that, and then go into the solutions that we have come up with. So Somer, I think you're controlling the slides, and here's a buy-side look at data flows as well. And then let's hop right into the meat of it on the next slide. So I think, first of all, this isn't all about consent. Consent is only one of 6 legal grounds under GDPR that you can rely on to collect and use personal data. Obviously, e-privacy throws a wrinkle in there. But as we thought about these issues, we talked to a lot of our clients on the publisher side, on the advertiser side, data providers. We really heard from the market that we needed to be very flexible and accommodate various publisher and vendor needs around transparency, control, and choice. This framework is not designed to maintain status quo in industry. I think everyone recognizes that the GDPR is going to shake up some things in industry and hopefully give back control to various parties in the ecosystem that may not be happy with everything that's been going on to date. So let's keep going on to the next slide. Some of these current challenges are data leakage, lack of control over and transparency over the partners and various demand sources that actually get access to a page and to user data. The fact that we don't all have a single privacy policy, we all have various ways that we use data. Our systems work differently, our technology functions differently. I've hit on e-privacy. That's quite a challenge, especially because it is being redrafted into a regulation in Brussels right now, and there's a lot of conversation going on around that. Various GDPR requirements around transparency, among others. Continued monetization, we want to ensure that our clients on the sell side can continue to monetize their sites, and that advertisers on the buy side can continue to reach the audiences that they want to reach. So as we thought about that, we thought about, there's closed ecosystems. Those do have benefits to them. It's much easier to control data leakage. Usually there's a single privacy policy. Some of these closed ecosystems have a much easier time of obtaining consent where they need to if they have a direct relationship with an end user versus a lot of independent third parties that have no connection to end users. And a lot of these closed ecosystems have been grappling with privacy issues for much longer than other smaller parties in the ecosystem. But on the flip side, a lot of our clients want to maintain control over their data and reporting. They do want to work with various third parties, and they want more control over the demand that they're seeing. So as we thought about all of that, we've thought about putting in place the standard framework. So the goals of it are really transparency for consumers first and foremost, and publishers into the partners that help monetize their sites and apps. Control for publishers over partners that actually operate on their sites and apps and that process their users' data. Control for consumers over how that data is used and which partners might get access to it. A framework that can allow for parties that need consent as a legal basis to obtain that. Standardization. This allows publishers and partners to actually operate and communicate efficiently using a single open source standard. Flexibility for publishers and demand sources to build or work with various consent management providers. This is essentially flexibility to allow for different tools to be used to communicate with consumers on websites. And then finally, minimize disruption. Obviously, again, we're not trying to push for the status quo, but we are trying to continue to ensure that consumers still get access to the content that they want to view, and that the publishers and supporting companies that provide that content can continue to operate as a business. So let's get into the various pieces of this framework. I think this is a good way to think about it. Down there in the lower left-hand corner, we have a nice orange blob, global vendor list. So the way we think about this is a standardized list of vendors. So those could be AdTech providers, those could be agency trading desks, data management platforms, any party in the ecosystem that as a controller needs to provide transparency to an end user about the fact that they might be on page or might be receiving personal data, which legal basis they're relying on, and the various purposes for which they're using that data. Then a website operator can go to that global vendor list. They can see all of the various vendors in industry that have made these disclosures and decide who they want to work with. So who they're going to allow access to their page and who they want the data of their end users passed on to. So just to reiterate, that global vendor list is not a list of all parties that a publisher or website operator has to use. So the publisher or website operator could then pull all that information from that global vendor list through a JSON file, it's quite easy, and populate the UI of their choice. I know there are a lot of large publishers out there that are building their own user interfaces. They want to control the messaging to their users. That's absolutely fine. There are a lot of coalitions in industry forming, login coalitions. Those coalitions have their own user interfaces. That also works fine with this framework. There are also various parties out in the ecosystem that just are independent and have kind of had what are considered tag management systems or consent management systems. Those can work fine with this transparency and consent framework as well. And then the final thing is, I know there are a lot of advertising technology providers that are also helping to put together various user interfaces that could be used. From there, those user interfaces are used to interact with consumers showing up on a website. The consumer has the ability to make choices about the various purposes for which vendors are using data, and if consent is needed to provide that consent. That information is then stored in a common format, which Summer will get into in much more detail in a minute. That is the reference architecture piece of this. So everyone in industry would be using the same language to pass along the information about a user's choice and consent where necessary. And then this last piece here, policy, for any vendor that is on this vendor list, there will be a common policy that they sign up to and agree to abide by, which has to do with how they handle these signals as they receive them in the ecosystem. And also has some baseline requirements for website operators in terms of how they actually surface this transparency and consent information to consumers, so that the vendors who are relying on those disclosures have comfort that the disclosures have been made, at least with a baseline of standardization across the industry. So Summer, I think we can go on. Here we go. So we've gotten a few common FAQs on the policy side. Let me hit up these first, and then I'm going to turn it over to Summer. One of the big questions we get is, do publishers have to facilitate transparency and or consent for all vendors on that vendor list? I already went into this, but no, publishers can control which vendors they want to work with. They pick the vendors, and users can further choose among those vendors and purposes. Does the framework only support global, i.e. web-wide, transparency and consent? No. The framework is actually designed to support either site-specific, service-specific, group, or global transparency and consent. And what that means is if a website operator is surfacing this information to provide transparency and obtain consent where necessary on their site, they can choose to just do that for themselves. They can choose to do that for affiliates, or they could do that globally, meaning if they've surfaced it once, any of the vendors behind the scenes could rely on those disclosures and consent if they need it. In Summer, we'll go into more detail on that. Does the framework support different purposes for different vendors? So this is one that we've given a lot of thought to as the technical pieces have been worked out. And right now, the current iteration absolutely allows for various purposes to be disclosed to an end user, but it doesn't support per vendor, per purpose, meaning it's very tough to have different purposes for different vendors because of the way the technical implementation works and the amount of data that would need to be passed throughout the ecosystem to support that. The last question we get a lot is who's going to maintain the pieces of this framework that need to be centrally managed? We are actively finalizing this. It should be finalized within the next week. IAB Europe will have a very important part to play in this, but we've also been talking to some industry groups that have a lot of experience managing industry reference architecture and technical projects like this one, so that it can continue to iterate and change over time as we watch the regulators after May and see how things shake out in industry. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Summer, who's going to get into a lot of the technical nuance behind what I was just discussing.
Thanks, Julia. I am trying, there we go. Trying to get to the next slide. Okay, so this is a not incredibly technical diagram of the way that the consent signal flows, but the point of this is to show you what are the centrally managed pieces, and then how that signal gets passed around to all the parties in the ecosystem. And I'll go into a lot more detail about that, the centrally managed pieces in just a second. But the thing to note here is that everything kind of keys off the publisher site or the website, the operator site. Any vendor that has code sitting directly on that website has access to the framework or has the JavaScript API that's a part of that framework, and can just ping it, understand if they have consent or not, and then do what they need to do. With the ad piece of it, ad serving is a little bit more difficult because you've got third parties that all the way up the chain that are all part of this, that all have to flow back through an ad server. So the way that this piece is going to work is that consent signal is grabbed from the JavaScript API. All consent signals for all vendors are captured in that, and then passed up the chain from through an open RTB extension, where anybody up the chain can see that, understand if they have consent or not, and then bid on bid requests, return campaigns, fire their cookies and pixels, and do what they need to do. Let's go into the individual pieces of this. So you heard Julia talk about the industry list and how it's the policies around it. One of the things to note with vendors, everyone who's a part of this ecosystem is going to have to do some kind of technical change to the way that they currently operate. And the way that we developed out the standard, we tried to minimize the amount of work as much as possible, and also work with technologies that people are already incredibly familiar with. So as little disruption as possible to the ecosystem. So this vendor list, people, companies get on it. It maintains their the company name, what purposes they need to get consent for, a link to their privacy policy, and they each get an ID. And the important thing about that ID is that ties into the consent signal itself and how vendors understand if they have consent when they're on a web page, or they get a bid request that they want to respond to. So the vendor list serves as a map, essentially, to the place where the consent signal is stored and communicated. And right now that is a third-party cookie, which I'll go into in a second. And within that cookie, each vendor has a spot where their consent is stored on a per device basis. So this vendor list also is available to power any user experience that someone develops. So, if you have a user experience where there's a screen where you need to list out the vendors, you've got all the information there. People don't have to develop it and find it and collate it on their own. They just make a call, get this information back, and create their user experience for consumers to give consent down to a per vendor basis if they want to. So the JavaScript API that I talked about, this is an important piece because this is the thing that allows everyone in the ecosystem to essentially speak the same language. It also takes the meat of the solution and centralizes that, but allows for the decentralization of the user experience that would be popped up and shown to users. So that gives a lot of choice and control to publishers in how they approach this. So anyone can basically leverage this this framework. People who are going to generate that user experience, we refer to them as consent management providers, and it can really be anybody. Publishers who want to manage their own user experience can actually build their own UX against the framework, host it all themselves. Everything's good. And there's also a number of other companies who are going to be developing solutions against this framework and making those available for publishers and website operators as well, advertisers too. So the core piece of this is the ability for anybody in the ecosystem, publishers, vendors, to basically communicate, get a call back, and understand if they have consent or not, and go about their way. Every vendor that's a part of the ecosystem, this is one of the things that that companies will need to agree to as far as a policy goes. No one can set a cookie or fire a pixel where they need to have consent to do so until they've actually received that consent signal. So this is one of the places where vendors will need to upgrade their tech. So for instance, Quantcast, we're going to be updating our measure tag. So for folks who are familiar with Quantcast analytics and tracking, it's a simple tag that's on the page, fires when users visit. We're going to make that actually not do anything until we've actually gotten a positive consent signal. And then once we do, we fire it, everything's good. And this also is the key piece to making that consent data available for all the downstream vendors as well through this daisy chain mechanism. People are going to pass it along. All right, so let's look at a couple of slides here. These are just for demonstration purposes only, some potential examples of custom UI. This is one that we've been kind of playing around and running some tests with, and will be also a part of a reference implementation that we make available when the framework is published publicly. So this is potentially what it could look like. You've got a modal that pops up with verbiage that explains what's being done to the consumer, why the purposes for tracking and what is being asked of them. They have the ability to accept cookies, reject, or dig down into the purposes level. Now this is a very conservative view on GDPR, and with thinking of the e-privacy regulation that's coming, and what it might entail. So this is a very conservative approach to a UX. There's also other versions that are being tested as well, where it might look very similar to today's cookie banner that you see on sites from the e-privacy directive, or lots of other options here. The key piece of this is really the language, and everyone who is producing these consent user experiences need to have sort of the same base level language being used. So that way, when consent is collected on one site that's a part of this framework, that ecosystem, when that user goes elsewhere and that same vendor sees them, they'll know that consent has been given under the same sort of context. So level 2, this is where per GDPR, people can see very transparently what purposes they are giving consent for. So these are also standardized centrally. We've got standard purposes, we've got the definitions, and each vendor will be basically providing which purposes they want to be capturing consent for. So that'll be displayed to the user. And then if a user wants to, they can actually dig down and see the full vendor list. This is very similar to what you see today with opt-out, ad choices, and some of the others. So if a user really wants to, they can get down to this level. We expect that a very, very small percentage will get down to this level just based on what we see today. But that capability is there to give consumers the ultimate transparency and flexibility. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the storage of the consent signal. So, so there's two mechanisms that consent storage requires. It's user identification method and a persistence method. So the identification method is needed for this global consent, right, to make it possible for everyone across the ecosystem to be able to understand the consent signal, see it, capture it, and then pass it along. So this implementation is determined by the publisher vendor, and the API standardizes this interaction, not the actual implementation. So in our case, the current way that the consent signal needs to be communicated within the framework around the ecosystem is a third-party cookie or a first-party cookie, depending on if you're doing global consent or if you're leveraging the service level consent. That's necessary for now. We went with that particular approach because a cookie is a known technical entity. Everybody uses them today. Everybody knows how to use them, and we could get to market really, really quickly with a solution leveraging cookies. Now, long term, that's likely to change because of all the problems there are with cookies. Browsers updating and setting their their default security settings to not allow for third-party cookies like Safari. Obviously, cookies don't work across mobile apps because each mobile app is its own little walled garden, and we've got to deal with the iOS in that particular situation. So we are looking at ways as a group to solve that problem and find a better storage mechanism than cookies for this consent to pass around, and that will be coming in the near future. Now, that doesn't mean that the persistent method for storing cookies, which is up to the people who want to build their own consent management solution, that's completely flexible and is up to the folks who are doing the development. They can capture consent, they can back that up in a database, do something amazing with some other technology. We've talked about a number of things, and then but then they have to take that and put that into a cookie so everybody else can read that, at least for now. And fortunately, the way that the framework is set up, the JavaScript API is completely separate from the consent storage. So it'll be relatively simple to swap that out kind of moving forward and keep the not have to do anything with the API. Okay, so vendors who are getting consent, the value is binary, and I talked about this a little bit. I'll show you what the cookie looks like in a second. It sounds like the cookie will be really, really huge, but it's not. I mean, it could potentially be if a consumer goes down to that vendor level and they individually toggle on each and every vendor, you're going to end up with a cookie that has a long string of ones and zeros in it. And depending on how that turns out, there's a lot of compression methods that we're going to be using and translation methods to make that cookie and thus the payload much smaller. So, for instance, if a consumer comes to a consent management screen and they just go, okay, yes, I consent to all cookies or to all vendors, it makes the cookie really simple, because all the cookie has to say is all vendors equals 1, or all equals 0. And we can also do cool things like say all vendors equal 1 except for vendors 12, 42, and 75. So there's a lot of things that we're doing to make sure that we really keep that payload small. And it's really super simple to transmit the signal around the ecosystem, especially up the daisy chain. And that piece will be, again, a part of the OpenRTB extension for that transmission. All right, so here's a little look at what the cookie could look like. You see it is a number of ones and zeros. This is the non-compressed version. If you look over to the right, you can see what a compressed version value would look like. The cool thing is that vendors don't have to read this cookie. In fact, they can't. They will actually ping the API and wait for a callback to tell them for their ID that they pass, whether they have a 1 or 0. So super simple, super fast, and then they can do what they need to do. So this eye chart kind of gives you a visual overview of what it looks like when that consent signal is passed around. Obviously, the green means that from this particular consent payload, that the green means that these are the vendors who have consent and can set cookies in FirePixels. The red are the ones who have not received consent. Pretty straightforward. So with all of these elements, the cool thing is it really gives publishers control over what's happening on their site. So, what vendors are collecting data and for what purposes. It gives transparency into the supply chain for both consumers and publishers. So consumers really understand who's tracking them and for what purposes, as do publishers. There's an auditable consent trail, which means that, and this is part of what the vendors will need to do. Every time they have a consent signal passed to them, they need to log that and keep an audit trail so that companies know, rather than assume that they actually have consent from a user and can back that up and prove it. I know a number of consent management providers are also looking at offering logging as part of the solution for publishers as well. So it also enables a better user experience than if everyone went out and tried to solve this on their own. by having that consent signal be something that can be transmitted around the ecosystem. When a user gives their consent and they go to another website that's also a part of this ecosystem, they're not going to get hit with the consent pop-up again necessarily. They may only see it, once a month. They may only see it once every 13 months. It just really depends on their browsing and if they clear cookies or not. But it creates a better experience for consumers. And when you have a better experience for consumers, there's a better likelihood that consent is going to be given for more publishers. And that's definitely something I think that we will be watching very, very closely as we roll this out and start to see people use it and understand how consumers are interacting and share that data with each other. So we've already obviously released the draft specifications, at least to the internal membership for IAB. And that's going to be released more publicly next week, I believe. And then the same is true of the policy standard. So that also comes out at the same time as the specifications for the API, the cookie, and the vendor list. The Open RTB extension spec should also be coming out this month. And we will have a reference implementation. I think there are a couple of them that will be shared when that technical specification is released publicly. So here you can see all the companies, some of which have actually been a part of developing the framework. These are the folks who have stepped up and said that they endorse it, and especially as vendors will be participating in the framework and leveraging that consent signal to do what they do. All right, so for more information, and this is where we'll also be posting additional information around the specifications, the policies, linking out to the reference implementations, and on advertisingconsent.eu. You can also get in contact with folks and get questions answered from there as well.